Hello, everyone, and we welcome you once again to this new edition of Living Word Live, your online church. Once again, presenting the subject matter that we have for our audience during this new edition are myself, Gio, and my father, Jesus.
Good evening, folks. Glad to be doing this once again with a little better capacity with my voice this time. A little better.
Like we said on Sunday, we spoke about a subject that it was going to require us to extend it to this day, to this particular transmission. Why? Because we had what we did was we brought up the subject during the Irrefutable podcast, and we told our audience that we would speak more on the issue during this edition of Living Word Live. Evidently, from the amount of people that are joining us now for the transmission and joining in more and more, it seems like it did pique an interest, and it should, because this is one of those texts that unless it is hermeneutically interpreted, meaning it is soundly interpreted according to what the text says in other places, then it could lead you to believe that, in fact, it is saying what it is, in fact, not saying. And therefore, as we had promised the audience during Monday's edition of the Irrefutable podcast, that we were going to take up specifically 1 Corinthians chapter number 6, verses 1 through 10. So we're going to do something on this edition that we don't normally accustom ourselves to do, but I think it's necessary considering the subject matter. We're going to exegete this text. Now, for some people, they'll say exegete. How do I use that in a sentence? It's a fancy word that preachers and theologians have used for some time now, and it's also used in the literary world to talk about how you take line by line and you necessarily examine the context wherein those lines appear to get a better understanding of what that passage means. It gives you more illumination and understanding with respect to that passage in particular. By the way, I will tell the audience, and this is something we've spoken about before, we will hearken back on a few occasions to Romans chapter number 13, verse 1 and 8 through 8. Why? Because this text here intimately ties in to what Paul mentions in that particular passage. Why? In both passages, there's a mention of Christian obedience and Christian disobedience. There's a mention of submission to civil law and when not to submit, as it were, to when civil law arises against the biblical mandate. Not only that, there's also a mention there of the particular reasonings why government necessarily exists and why it is placed by God and the parameters with which it needs to operate. All of those things are present. And I think, we're praying that we'll be able to cover those when we engage in analysis of the text.
And unfortunately, believers, Christians, the faulty hermeneutics that they embrace, apparently they can't seem to see that they are contradicting. In other words, there is no harmony between what they believe Romans tells them and Corinthians tells them. Yeah. And we need to find that harmony because there is no contradiction in the Bible.
Exactly. Well, let's get right to it. Let's read the verses. And then, again, if you feel the need to pause and to comment, we'll do so. If any of you has a dispute with another, by the way, some will ask, what's the topic? Because I simply logged on and I didn't take the time to see what the topic is. The topic for our consideration this evening is, should Christians use the courts? We need to be more specific on the titling. What do I mean by this? Where it's not that we're not being specific here, it's that I know some people would tend to say, well, I don't think it's illegitimate for Christians to use the courts. Yeah, but there's Christians out there who will tell you that in no circumstance whatsoever Christians should appeal to the courts because of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter number 6. That's why we left the title a bit broad, because although those that have read this text will say, but it says there, Gio Jesus, that Christians ought not take each other to the tribunals. Well, again, we're going to cover that as well because you run the gamut, the beliefs on the matter of this text, they run the gamut, and that's why we want to answer that question more broadly.
This is why on the podcast, we broke the question down into two parts. Using the courts when, for example, you're filing a lawsuit against sinners, and then you're using the courts when you file a case against a brother, because the need arises, the situation is it's just there, and there's something that has to be done. Otherwise, you're moving outside of justice. If you don't file the case, you're moving outside of righteousness. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here.
Yep.
So I think it's important that we clear that up.
Let's read the entirety of the text. It says, if any of you has a dispute with another, do you dare to take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the Lord's people? Or do you not know that the Lord's people will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more things of this life? Therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, do you ask for a ruling from those whose way of life is scorned in the church? I say this to your shame. Is it possible that there is nobody wise among you to judge a dispute between believers? But instead, one brother takes another to court, and this in front of unbelievers. The very fact that you have lawsuits among you means that you have been completely defeated already. Instead, you yourselves cheat and do no wrong. And I do this, and you do this to your brothers or sisters. Or do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men whom have sex with other men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. From the very onset, Dad, I'd like to focus on the very first verse, hearkening back to Romans chapter number 13, verses 1 and on, because it will give us more clarity on what Paul says here. It says,
and I think we should once again mention, like we did in Irrefutable, that this is catapulted because of the situation that we read about in the 5th chapter. There is a guy who is having a sexual relationship with his stepmother. And so this brings about the things that were said in chapter 5, and then it continues here in chapter 6.
Yes. By the way, I did forget to read a particular portion of the text, and it says in verse number 7, the latter half, why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? That is a linchpin for a lot of people when they read this particular text, and it seems as if it overrides everything else that is either implicit or explicit in the text. And we'll get to that shortly.
There are so many things to cover, and we'll try and take them all one at a time. But you know, those whose way of life is scorned in the church, not every judge is below the Mendoza line. Not every judge, when you look at his or her lifestyle, do you go, oof, this person shouldn't be a judge. So there's just a lot of particulars in what Paul wrote here that needs consideration in order to get into a proper mindset and in order for you to proceed correctly as it pertains to maybe perhaps filing a lawsuit when something has gone seriously wrong. Because I'll just say this right off the bat, if it's something simple, I guess they'll call it in the legal circles frivolous. Come on. We're talking about stuff that issues, crimes even, that you have to really consider. You have to take it seriously. I think I need to take this to court.
Remediation, absolutely,
Right.
and justice. First text here. If any of you has a dispute with another, do you dare take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the Lord's people? I know what some people are going to say with what I'm about to say, and I would ask the audience to please be patient with me in explaining this, because there is an essential point that I'm attempting to make here, and please don't misunderstand my words. It's important that I say this because some will misinterpret what I'm about to say to mean that I'm undermining the authority of what the biblical text says, and I'm not doing that.
Right.
I'm going to ask a rhetorical question to be able to begin to prove that there's more than meets the eye in both texts. Once again, 1 Corinthians 6 and on, Romans 13, 1 and on. If any of you has a dispute with another, do you dare to take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the Lord's people? Well, then we would have to ask Paul, why is it that you say in Romans chapter number 13 that the, let's call them authorities, are there to punish the evildoers, and that this has been placed by God himself to keep the peace among other reasons? Wouldn't that necessarily then attack inherently what Paul is saying here about Christians not taking other Christians or other people that aren't Christian sinners before tribunals, if in fact in Romans chapter 13, Paul says that the authorities are instituted by God to keep the peace and to praise those that do well in the Lord's service?
Plus, if you misconstrue what Paul is saying, then the argument will lead us into perhaps Paul is saying, this would be a faulty argument, but this is where you're led to if you don't interpret these verses correctly. Perhaps Paul is saying that Christians should have a Sharia of sorts. Because if we are to sit in judgment, some of us, whomever the church chooses, for really important cases, then we're basically saying that the church should have some kind of Sharia law and that it should have weight to the point that people will have to do whatever the verdict says the person has to do. And we all know that we can't have that. That's just not going to fly. As a Christian, I don't want Sharia law. I don't want a biblical law ruling the totality of society. I think that would be wrong. But nevertheless, people start interpreting what Paul says, and he's basically, according to their argument, saying you should be able to judge these things. Again, there are things that are just simple to judge. Let's have a meeting, get the deacons involved, get the pastor involved, let's take care of this, and we resolve it. If the individual says no, then Jesus talked about even getting to that point where you have to tell that person, you just lost your membership.
There is an order within the ecclesia, within the church, to deal with these particular matters.
Right.
As a matter of fact, again, hearkening back to Romans chapter number 13, and let me clarify this even more to assure the audience that I'm not undermining what the scripture says on the matter. It's evident then that when we begin to take both texts and we join them, it's evident, verse number 2 begins to clarify it for us, or do you not know that the Lord's people will judge the world? Paul's main complaint here against the Corinthians is that if you're truly believers and you have the Spirit of God indwelling in you, why can't you resolve these matters away, as it were, from the potential that there is in the world to go to these people that they won't judge the matter correctly because they're not in the church, they're not Christians, they don't understand the particulars, as it were, of how Christians treat each other, the Christian ethic. In other words, you're putting yourself at the mercy, potentially, of judges whom are corrupt, and you think they're going to actually accurately judge those cases adequately? That's the crux of Paul's argument here, among other things.
But if we flip that, then we'll take, let's make up an example here. There's a guy that beats up his wife or vice versa, which happens today. And all of a sudden, the church is going to take that up. How many people there, how many congregants will say, forgive and forget?
Right.
When there was actually a lot of damage, there's a lot of fear involved now, and that was criminal activity.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? Again, I'm not for some kind of Christian Sharia law.
Yeah, something like what Calvin had in Geneva, for example.
Exactly. So I think cases like this example that we're giving, you have to take these things to court, because this brings up the issue of divorce. Some people believe the only reason that a Christian couple can get divorced is because of adultery, unfaithfulness. How about if there's incest involved?
Right.
How many times are you going to allow your daughter to be beaten up, Dad, before you say, daughter, it's time to put an end to this Christian marriage? So you see, a lot of people, when they speak, you can feel the hot air coming out. But when reality hits them, all of a sudden, they're not in agreement with the popular interpretation that people have given to what Paul is dealing with here. If there is criminality involved, if we are allowing the world to look at us, and we're actually allowing them to say, look at these people, they actually allow criminal activity to go unpunished.
Yep.
And then they talk about righteousness and they talk about justice. We need to be very careful with this.
There's another example that I gave for this week's podcast episode, an irrefutable, which, by the way, if any of you have not heard it, we would encourage you to visit our Substack website or through Telegram. The links are beneath in the video player. One of the things that I had brought up during that particular episode was, well, then what do you do in cases where believers are engaging, let's say, in business with one another, and then one believer doesn't meet his obligations? I know what some will say. We addressed it, but I'm going to repeat it for the sake of making it relevant to what we're talking about here. Well, Paul says here in verse 7, Gio, you read it, why rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? So what you're saying, dear Christian, is that we ought to allow all sorts of cheating, all sorts of wrongs, all sorts of injustices, all sorts of manifestations of irresponsibility and faithlessness and things of this nature to go unpunished. Then I believe, dear Christian, that if you believe like this, we're going to live in a lawless society, which, by the way, isn't this one of the reasons that many Christians are complaining what has happened to the United States, that now, since we're no longer obedient, as it were, to the law of the Lord, being a Christian nation, so to speak, isn't that one of the complaints that Christians have about what's happening with the current administration and whatnot? You can't have it both ways. Like you said, this is the hot air that Christians tend to spew. Instead of sitting back and thinking, wait a minute, am I being consistent in what I believe?
And then some of these Christians that you are using as an example, somebody cuts them off, all hell breaks loose.
Correct.
I take no one to court. I believe in letting all go free, because when I set people free by forgiving them, I really am making myself free. You just cross me up, you just get in my lane, and all hell breaks loose there. So we see the hypocrisy. Let's call it what it is.
That's exactly
and
what it
the
is.
religious mentality that comes to the forefront instead of trying to figure out what was Paul trying to say, because I can't see in any of the things that he wrote that Paul is asking us to live outside of a fair legal system. But there it is. All legal systems are unfair. There's probably some truth to that, but as unfair as it seems, it's even more unfair when criminality and wrongdoings go unpunished. No, because what happens is, dear brothers, Christian love just blots out everything. That's just not the way it works. That is just not the way it works. And so I think Paul is writing
Sounds
about
more like hippies there.
exactly. They're going back to San Francisco.
That's right.
I think Paul is talking about trivial things. First of all, the way that Paul writes this, and he says, don't you guys know that we are going to judge the world, talking about believers and angels? And when you listen to that, it seems like he's telling us that everybody is going to sit in judgment of angels and of the world. And I think that's a little exaggerated there, because when you read, for example, about the bema seat of Christ, that's Christ that's going to be judging. Yeah, but we're talking about judging the world. Well, then we move to the white throne judgments, and that's, once again, Jesus judging. So you need to be careful, because not everybody is going to sit in judgment of X amount of people or, different groups. You need to read that carefully, because in this life, you didn't show yourself faithful to carry on in the life to come these levels of responsibility. I seriously doubt you're gonna have a throne and a courtroom to judge others.
It's a very curious thing you're mentioning that, because in the Old Testament, when the system of judges is being set up, and Moses, of course, was the patriarch that God used to set the system up, which, interestingly enough, when God gives the responsibility to Moses, it's Moses' father-in-law that tells me, you're going to bring yourself out from having to judge all these cases. Why don't you set up a system where, yes, you're, as it were, the arbiter of God, but then you have these smaller courts that can deal with all these particular cases? Because let's face it, we're talking about humanity here. You're talking about trivial cases. Even Paul himself mentions it in verse 2. And if you're to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Part of the reason that Paul is writing this to the Corinthians is that they were taking themselves to court over stupidities, over things that they should have been
Judge
able.
Judy kind of stuff.
But this is, this puts in highlight one of the essences that goes overlooked about this particular portion of text. These people were taking themselves to tribunals over things that, if you and I, looking at it practically, were to examine these cases, you would say, why are these people even taking this?
He stole my water. Oh, Your Honor. But, on the other side of this, Gio, we have people, Christians, saying, no, we should never use the courts, never use the legal system. We are talking about people that exalt Moses, the lawgiver, the law, and the system that God set in place for a nation to be special, for a nation to be righteous. I see the arguments they make, and I'm going like, are they talking about one and the same God that gave all of this in the Old Testament, and all of a sudden in the New Testament, it's basically get a kangaroo court going and take care of that, or take care of everything?
Sure. You have to see things, folks, with respect to, and this is why we've spoken consistently against the Calvinist understanding of how they deal with the epochs, as it were, as the times. Dispensationalism is an indelible part of understanding God's economies and things of that nature.
They were whipping people back then.
Yes.
And he decided what colors Christians could use and which were anathema.
Yep.
And so if this is what you think Paul was alluding to, then knock yourselves out.
And Calvin was judge, jury, and execution.
Absolutely.
And by the way, for being this righteous man that Calvin is
And
saying,
Calvinists will deny that, thinking that nobody's really read up on what this guy was doing all that time.
Calvin, among other things, was as corrupt as they come. he sold himself, of course. He propagandized himself to the people of Geneva as this just judge that was following the Old Testament. Well, let's be more specific. He was actually, even though he didn't want to admit it, he, at least in public, he tried to follow the precepts of Augustine and the city of God. I've told people that have asked me this question.
That was his hero.
It was his hero. What was it? There was a particular portion in Institutes where he says, I feel like as if Augustine is flowing through me in these words. And it was in essence the same thing. When you read Augustine's The City of God, you're looking at a man whom in essence is saying, we, the Roman Catholic Church, are the arbiters, as it were, of the civil law here. We can apply it as we see fit. But of course, we have biblical backing to do it. And this is where Calvin ended up saying, in the case of Michael Servetus, which curiously enough, Michael Servetus wasn't a Christian, but he had more sense about God's character, and he arose civilly, by the way. He did it very cordially against Calvin's teaching about what God, about God's character and so-called predestination. And what did Calvin do? When this guy comes through here, I'm going to get at him for vengeance. For a simple theological disagreement, and then he sends him to death, and he puts greenwood to burn him at the stake so that it would take a lot longer for him to die. This is the sort of person that Calvinists exalt as one of God's many indelible characters.
We heard one preacher say, we should all say, thank God for Calvin. Remember him?
That is correct. That is correct. We did hear that. Now, as we begin to clarify even more what the text says, it becomes evident, folks. As we've said before, there is no contradiction in the text. But it's necessary for the Christian to, as it says, Paul to Timothy, divide the word of God properly, because one of the problems that Christians get into is when they take a simplistic understanding of the world, a reductionist understanding of the world, which the world promotes, and unfortunately many Christians adopt, and then they apply it to the text without understanding that human nature is necessarily complicated and complex, and these things have to be thought through in order to arrive at a proper place. I was mentioning earlier the system of the judges in the Old Testament. Let me ask you a question, folks. This is a system that God himself established. Don't you think that there was a time in Israel's period where, yes, you would say, man, I hope I land before this judge because that guy's righteous. But then you were thinking, oh boy, if my case comes before this guy who has, an example of this would be Samuel's kids. It says so very clearly in first book of Samuel that his children were not righteous judges, that they took bribes and things of...
They were corrupt as they come.
They were not like their father. They were corrupt. And it even says that the people told Samuel, your kids are they're not like you, which was to Samuel's shame. There's another lesson to be learned on that, a separate side note. How is it possible that Samuel, understanding how God took away the mantle, so to speak, from Eli because he didn't educate his kids properly or discipline them, how did Samuel not take that lesson to heart and apply it with respect to his own kids? Another subject for another day. But you see, there's so much complexity, there's so much intricacy in this topic that it can't simply be reduced to, well, Paul says here that we shouldn't be wrong, that we rather not be cheated, so let's just drop all these things.
Then we need to bring Paul into question. And what do I mean by that? So why would Paul appeal to Caesar? Why would Paul argue his case, his position in front of authorities? All Paul had to do was basically say, I refuse to defend myself.
Dad, who was you just vividly brought it back to me. Who was the proconsul, if I'm not mistaken, that Paul says, I'm glad that I'm able to bring forth my defense against you. I'll look it up shortly, but he said, I'm glad that I'm able to present this before you. And it was a high-ranking official in the Roman government.
Or he appealed to the highest levels of government. And then they were going to put a whooping on him. They were going to beat him and says, are you going to beat a Roman citizen? Whoa, wait a minute. We didn't know you were a Roman citizen. How did you get it? Then the guy says, I paid a lot of money for mine. He says, well, I have it by birth. And so we see Paul using the system. Therefore, what we find here in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 cannot be what the religious interpretation of it tells us it is.
Agrippa. Now it says here, Paul, Acts 26, then Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. So Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself, I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I am accused by the Jews. Very interesting, Paul being a Jewish man, right? But he did have Roman citizenship, especially because you are expert in all the customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently. Seems to me like Paul was appealing to what he considered to be a just judge of thing in some cases.
Once again, read very, very carefully First Corinthians chapter 6, then Romans 13, and start putting the pieces together, and don't allow your mind to be influenced by the religious interpretations that have been applied to these verses. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself where sinners want to be. What do I mean by that? Sinners will tell you in a very astute way, listen, heads I win, tails you lose. They'll take Romans 13, do whatever they want with it. Typically, the religious interpretation to that is you have to submit to any and all things government. That's what they'll tell you. And then they'll move over to 1 Corinthians 6, and they basically are telling you, listen, you can have absolutely nothing to do with the court system, the legal system, because that's government, and you don't want to get yourself involved with that. So wait a minute, I have to submit to that, and then when I need to use it, I can't use it. You can't have it both ways.
Yeah,
folks.
it's folks. This is again, and I deign that some people would sometimes interpret our repetition of things as being a sign of redundancy and that we don't have anything actually to say. No, repetition is like pedagogy, or however you pronounce it. I know some people pronounce it differently. The intention of being able to teach something so that it's ingrained. Repetition is important. When we were in grade school, they would teach us the ABCs, and you had to repeat writing it over and over again so it would be ingrained. The reason we repeat these things, like some of the things that we're talking about tonight, is so that this stands out in your mind, so that the unfortunately simplistic understandings and interpretation of these texts, which, like you said earlier, comes from a lot of sanctimony and hot air, it would not persuade you to believe that that's what the Bible actually says. There's more here when you begin to unpack the text than what some would say is the plain reading of the text of the matter. But again, the text itself clarifies to us where the context is that we ought to take this. The same thing happens with Romans chapter 13. With Christians who say, you see, you have to submit in absolutely everything. Whoa, pump the brakes there, cowboy. We see in Acts that the apostles, when civil government arose against God's mandate, they said, you decide, either we obey you or we obey God. It was a rhetorical way of saying we're not going to obey you because you're going up against God. But Paul says in Romans chapter 13 that the authorities have been placed there by God to chastise, to bring down the
strike fear.
Exactly.
In the wrongdoers.
But then if you interpret the text properly, what happens on the flip side? When suddenly government actually turns against the innocent, is actually enabling the evildoers. Then
who enables that on many occasions? Believers.
Yeah.
Folks, a few years ago, this goes back a little bit, I'm sitting in my office and I hear a woman screaming. I look through the window and what do I see? Two kids basically ripping her earrings, her little necklace, and holding a knife to her neck. So I guess I wasn't thinking somebody would say. I get out of the office and I start screaming at those kids, and they ran away. I said, lady, are you okay? She says, yeah, I'm just a little bit shaken up with this, but I'm okay. The police gets there, and the officer tells me what happened, and I let him know what I heard and what I saw. I says, if I take you on my cruiser and we ride around some blocks here, can you identify these two? And I said, sure.
Yeah.
And sure enough, he knew where these hoodlums would be hanging around.
In other words, they were known to the police department.
Exactly. I said, there they are. Those are the two. And he said, you stay back there. And he looked like he was going to do nothing. When he got really close to them, he opened the door and he points the gun at him, says, freeze, don't even think about moving. He handcuffs them. They get sent to jail. All of a sudden, a few days later, maybe a couple of weeks later, you know that the system is slow. I get a visit in my office from a senior fella, an older man, maybe in his late 50s. He says, I am the father of one of the suspects, one of the two hoodlums. He says, I'm here because I already spoke to the lady and she's willing to drop the cases. But the state is not willing to drop the case. The city is not willing to drop the case. And I'm wondering if you can add a little weight to this by you not serving as a witness. And I said, so you are the father? And he says, yes, I am. I have flown all the way from New York to help my child because he needs help. I said, I'm not going to drop my position of being a witness. Furthermore, when we are done here, I'm going to go talk to my neighbor because I risked my life for her. Yep. And she better show up. And so I had a serious conversation with her. I said, so you put my life in jeopardy by screaming for help. I respond to you. I come to you.
Exactly.
And now you're not going to go to court over this. Let me finish the story by saying that they had a plea bargain, but nevertheless, they did a few years in jail because daddy was on the scene ready to relieve his kid from any
justice.
If you'll notice what's been going on in some of the stores in California and in other states, the hoodlums that are ripping into the stores and taking everything, they're not using arms. They don't take knives. They don't take revolvers, pistols, weapons into the store. Why? Because they know that if they get caught, they're not armed, it's a lesser degree of punishment and the charge will be less. So these hoodlums, they know what they're doing. And one of the things that they bank on is that you and I will be scared. We won't be there to press charges. Now, you say, yeah, but the topic is brother against brother. And do you think that if a brother is caught doing these things, all of a sudden, because he is just a brother, you have to go, no, yeah, let's go ahead and punish the sinners. But if it's a brother who slipped, he had a little carnal moment, let's not do a thing about that. Do you think that this is what we should do? This is the way we should go? We need to think about these things very carefully because the world is always looking. It's amazing, Joe. It's really sad when I think about it because we're always told, keep your testimony clean so that when sinners take a look at your walk and they take a look at your conversation, they can see righteousness and they can see justice. And then we say things like the things that some believers say as they interpret Romans 13 and Corinthians 6. All of a sudden, sinners are not paying attention. Are they not going to say, look at these people. They're lawless people. They allow all kinds of things to go on. And then they'll go like, the blood of Christ cleanses you, and you are no longer a thief. You are no longer a murderer.
Yeah.
Are you kidding?
He gets us. He gets us.
Exactly.
Dad, I what I'm about to say, and I want the audience to understand this. This is no way, shape, or form to one up what my dad, the narrative my dad just appealed. But this is just to add further weight. When we give these examples, vivid examples, real life examples, it's to prove how these emotionalist interpretations and erroneous interpretations of the text actually allow lawlessness to go unchecked. One time, I have a person, intimate person that I know, told me that their family member, a police officer, got into a heated argument with this a family member of theirs that is a police officer. And it was over justice, it was over righteousness. This is what the police officer said to this person. So you're telling me that if your father, your mother were to engage in criminality, that you wouldn't go out and defend them? This person that is intimate to me looked at the police officer says, and you're a police officer? You're supposed to be upholding the law? You see, folks, when we allow these evil misinterpretations, this is part of what Dad was just saying.
And I think it needs to be said, that is a household of faith that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's important.
Yeah.
Because maybe the people that are listening go, they're all sinners. That's the way they think. This is a household of faith.
Correct. Folks, the issue of justice is one that has been so misinterpreted by Christians throughout the years that Christians ourselves have been at fault for allowing a lot of the criminality that goes on to go unchecked. In the case of
Christians should not be police officers. And Christians should not be attorneys, and Christians should not be judges.
I've heard that. In fact, when you think about it, if you are a righteous judge of things, why shouldn't you involve yourself in the system?
And furthermore, when Christians sit and say, I'm going to be sitting in judgment of the world and of angels, what are you going to judge them with?
That's a good point. Mind you, you're falling into the very trap. I don't mean you. I mean, when people that argue this way, you're falling into the very trap of the world that doesn't want Christian influence in the system when, in fact, it should be the other way around.
But the point is that I'm going to sit in judgment of the world and in judgment of fallen angels. What are you going to use? What's the tool? What's the instrument?
Exactly.
Well, there has to be a law system that is going to be in place and will be used, and you need to be familiar with it if you're going to sit in judgment of them.
Absolutely. Folks, that's all the time that we have left for this edition.
That's a shame. We should, there's so much material here.
So much more material. Perhaps we'll take it up in another edition a bit more because there's, again, if you think about it, we were only able to cover a few verses. I really thought that we might be able to cover a few more verses from 1 Corinthians 6, but maybe we'll cover some more in a future edition of Living Word Live, your online church. We'll repeat again, there are people everywhere now that are finding it very difficult to find not only local churches that are sound doctrinally, but even churches that might be hours away from them, which is a shame, and it speaks, unfortunately, to the sad state of the church nowadays. But God has given us this miraculous gift, this marvelous gift known as the internet, where, for example, the people that are watching us tonight, people that are watching after the recorded live stream, they're able to tune into these things and learn and be edified where it's difficult for them to have a local church to go. We want to be your online church. We ask you that if you have not subscribed yet to the means that we are using to put out this content for your edification, that you would do so. They're beneath. The links are beneath in the video description. We are using Substack. We are currently using Telegram as well. And we would also ask you two other things. If this content continues to edify you and inform you, let others know about the existence of Living Word Live so they too may know about the truth that is being withheld from them, including in very many churches. Because let's face it, I doubt that sincere Christians, honest, sound Christians would want to go to a local church on Super Bowl Sunday and have the preacher kick the Bible as a representation of Super Bowl, the celebration of Super Bowl. What, Gio? You're joking. Look it on the internet. You'll find that there were churches all around the states that in celebration of Super Bowl Sunday, they actually had their so-called preachers dressed in referee garb and kicking the Bible around like if they were kicking field goals. It's actually out there on the internet. You'll be able to find it. And also, we would encourage you to to donate. It is through the economic means that we can put this content out for your edification. Please use the PayPal link that we have put beneath the video so that you would donate and help us to continue to put out this content. Before we conclude, we want to thank you for your economic aid and for your consideration. Have a couple of other podcasts that are coming up throughout the week through Telegram and through Substack. If you have not subscribed to these services, please do so that you would be alerted as to when these things are published. And again, that's all the time that we have left.
I think we want to say thank you to all these people that were chiming in and just appreciating the program and sending blessings our way.
Absolutely. Thank you, each and every one of you. We will gather again, virtually again, on Sunday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the next edition of Living Word Live.
Judge Judy will be with us.
That's all the time we have left until the next occasion that we meet. May the Lord shine his face upon you.